much to everyone who's attending and to our wonderful panel. This is our program, and without undue delay, I would like to ask our dear panelists to introduce themselves. So a couple of minutes about what are you working on, what are you passionate about, and what drives you forward. So if I may start with Kathy.
So hi everyone, great to be here and speaking with you today. So I'm Kathy Mulligan. I've been working in digital transformation and researching it for many years now. I'm a professor of computer science here in Lisbon, and I have been working with blockchain Web3 since about 2009. I started working with blockchain, started doing research in that space. So I'm interested in all things digital and how we can achieve sustainable economic growth using these technologies.
Thank you very much, Kathy. So next on my screen is Jocelyn. Please, if you could introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, my name is Jocelyn Pawley. I'm a Technology, Privacy and Data Partner at Gowling WLG. So my day-to-day diet of work is looking at contracts that relate to any kind of technology and increasingly the data that's associated with that technology. That's from a contractual point of view, negotiating those contracts, which means I get a really privileged insight into how some of these solutions work, which I very much enjoy, and I work all up and down the tech stack, working with data center co-location operators at one end, SaaS providers at the other end, and then customers and end users of those systems. And I'm also a data protection and privacy lawyer, because obviously those two things are very complementary, and clearly that's a really interesting and developing area. I was working in it long before GDPR in 2018, so it's my privilege to see this industry, legal theory, and the day-to-day practice and how it affects our lives growing and maturing and becoming more sophisticated, and then working out how it applies to things like Web3.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn. Definitely so valued to have your expertise and many years of experience here with us. Elizabeth, you're next on my screen. Please tell me about yourself and your work and focus on Web3.
Okay, hi everyone. My name's Elizabeth Mackay. I work for PA Consulting, so we are a management consultancy working with clients across a range of sectors, including defence and security, public services, financial services, retail, bringing innovative solutions to our clients. We operate globally. We have offices in Denmark as well as the UK. So personally, I focus on privacy and helping clients understand potential benefits and risks from data and new technologies. In terms of passion, I'd say I'm particularly interested in, privacy, but also understanding the individual and societal potential harms that are brought about intentionally or unintentionally through technology and associated use of data. And then working with clients to help mitigate those or avoid these harms. I started my career working for UK government as a cybersecurity researcher.
Elizabeth, thank you so much. Wonderful. Look forward to hearing your thoughts on some of the questions here. Joel, you are next. Would you please tell us about yourself, your background, and your main focus now?
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for having me over. I've been working in the Web3 space, I guess, since 2015, and started working on like different sort of identity projects using blockchain technology. Now I'm co-founder of a company called 3Box Labs. We're focused on building a network called Ceramic Network, and it's focused on just like generally data in Web3, and we see identity as being something that's an emergent property based on that. I'm passionate about just like seeing how we can use this technology to better understand the world and to better live in the world.
Thank you so much, Joel, and thank you, everyone. I would like to, without undue delay, to jump into some of our topics. Of course, these are split in 3 different subtopics. So it's privacy, security, and regulation. And I know that we have quite a bit of ground to cover in this rapidly evolving world of Web3. And of course, something that is a little slower is the regulatory landscape. But irrespective of that, we need to understand both to operate efficiently. So my first question is about the main characteristics of Web3. And Joel, you as a veteran builder in the space, I would like to ask you, what are these? Would you please sketch the landscape of the main features of Web3?
Yeah, I would say probably it's 2 main things. People generally say decentralization when they think about Web3. That doesn't really mean that much if you like dig into it. I would say it's mostly around, we have attribution, so we can see who did what, and who meaning is some like abstract notion of an account. And we can have verifiability. So we can see the history of what took place, and we can verify this on any computer in principle. And this doesn't mean that everything is transparent. Some things are transparent in Web3, but you can also have things that are verifiable but still private.
That's amazing. To immutability and transparency, at least some level of transparency. Catherine, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I'm probably a little bit older, so I've probably seen a couple of these different things. I think that Web3 for me is a really interesting topic in the sense that originally I don't really think it had too much to be done to do with decentralization itself. It was originally about semantic web, so you know, connecting different data streams together in new ways, basically, put very simply. And the concepts of decentralization have been introduced because of these ideas around privacy protection and also trying to create transparency and you know, a track and trace capability within the technology, because as all of the panelists will be well aware, one of the biggest issues with data is that you can easily reuse it in places and manners that it shouldn't be. So for me, Web3 is very much around the coming together of a group of technologies that are emerging in the world today. And I think, to be perfectly honest as well, Web3 doesn't actually yet exist. It's a slogan for a bunch of technologies that we are working on. So yeah.
This is an absolute phenomenal introduction. So thank you so much. And of course, 2 complementary views, immutability, transparency, at least some level of transparency, and a combination of different technologies that go hand in hand to create this new version of the internet that got this label of Web3 without anyone necessarily being able to give it a very concise definition of what Web3 is. So, and thank you so much for covering this. So I will go to our next question to understand, why are these aspects perceived as valuable by users and teams? So users, of course, already existing users in Web3 or someone who wants to, but also very much teams that are building in Web3 today. So Joel, I will once again go to you as the builder in Web3.
Yeah, I don't know, like as a builder, I think like the values that really brings builders in are like the values that would make a builder a user as well. Of course, there are like different types of users in the Web3 ecosystem. Some are like very shallow, like want to use the system for some very short-term gain, but some people actually see the sort of like powerful nature of the technology and like how we can actually restructure part of how we organize society based on these tools. And I think the latter is where most of the builders sort of land. We're like, hey, these are like really powerful fundamental technologies that can change how we organize as groups, as individuals within groups, and how we distribute wealth and so on in various ways. So I think that's sort of like what's driving a lot of the builders in the space, like seeing the possibility of like these new ways of organizing better in better ways.
Thank you very much. So different way of organizing, a better way of organizing, and a better way of distributing work and and power governance to some extent. Kathy, do you want to add something to that as another veteran of Web3?
Yeah, so I think there's some really exciting sort of attributes that you can get with these technologies. So, for example, previously, if you were going to move data around between different companies or different people, there was no real way to ensure that the data hadn't been tampered with or that it hadn't been, manipulated in transit. And a lot of the Web3 technologies, in particular, with regards to data, enable you to prove some of these things. It creates trust in the data stream. I get very worried about people thinking blockchain creates trust. I think people create trust, and technology allows you to verify some of these things, right? So, so I think that is what's particularly interesting for quite a few people, in the sense that you can actually verify, if you can verify data, and if you can verify people's identity, for example, you're able to have new types of interactions on the internet that were previously not possible, because people could fake their identity, or they could fake data, or things like this. And we used to say on the internet that nobody knows you're a dog, but with these technologies, you can now irrefutably prove to everybody that you are a dog, if that makes sense.
Yes. I wonder if Jocelyn or Elizabeth have seen anything from their clients that make them attracted to Web3 or curious about Web3. Is there anything that you feel or see?
I think at the very early days of maybe blockchain, if not Web3, there was the question about, is this an ideal place for those who don't want to be identified to do whatever they want to do in terms of nefarious activities? Partially, I suppose, because it's a new technology, so not being widely used, not well understood by regulators, and certainly not regulated. And we've talked about the privacy versus the transparency. You can see what's going on, but associating an individual with a name, with some kind of key or code, is very difficult. That has been the early attractions, although once business looks at it, you see it in a commercial sense and provenance, and as Kathy was saying, that proof that this thing I am giving you, or that I say I own, is the same as this thing over here, and I can actually verify that. That has been some of the early uses I've seen, and then linked to smart contracts to then give effect to item A moved from here to B under a particular set of conditions, and therefore a payment is released on delivery of said item. So some real world applications, and I'm interested to hear about other applications across the internet rather than sort of between two parties.
Thank you very much, everyone. So ability to verify, ability to trust, and a different way of organizing and real life use cases that rely on these core principles. So from your perspective, and Catherine and Joel, once again, so you know the technology, you know what it's capable of. In your opinion, why do you think established businesses should be interested in utilizing the technology? And do you have any potential use cases, real life use cases, where this tech can solve some of the existing issues that we're facing today? Kathy, do you want to go first? I know you have lots of.
I was going to say, so I think that, why should business be interested? Well, as Jocelyn was saying, there are some interesting characteristics of the technology that can give us new types of business models, new ways to interact with one another on the internet. And I think we are seeing an increasing interest from a number of different corporations in the space. In terms of, do I see any interesting use cases? I see loads of them. I mean, we built over 40 sort of proof of concepts when I was working in the UK at one of the universities there. So I think the answer, however, or the question that I think is most important is, You know, I could tell you that there's I could build a million use cases for you. The real issue is what is the most appropriate and most useful application of the technology. And, you know, we see this in a lot of different general purpose technologies, for example, 5G, you know, where is it the most appropriate place to use this technology? So one of my favorites, however, is, you know, I'm looking at how can we use these types of technologies to create different types of funding and mechanisms for civil infrastructure. I know that seems like a bit of a stretch there, but you know, that's what research is. Looking forward in the future, everyone talks very much around blockchain in the digital realm at the moment. I'm very interested to see how can we use some of these technologies potentially to fund civil infrastructure in a new and different way. I think there's some really interesting use cases that could be put forward around decentralization, which would help us if we created a very loosely coupled centralized decentralization, very weird thing to say, but if we could decouple some of the supply chains that we have around the world, we could actually dramatically reduce humanity's impact in terms of climate change as well, while still benefiting from, you know, some of the great things around globalization, such as sitting on this call with people from all over the world. So yeah, that was just my highlight. There you go, Joel.
Civil funding of civil infrastructure, different ways of funding and different ways of governance. Joel, what about you? What are your favorite use cases, real life use cases, and also reason why established businesses should look into utilizing blockchain?
Yeah, no, I think funding of public goods is definitely an interesting one, and just like finding new ways of funding public infrastructure or public research, public like things that are sort of anti-rivalrous in nature that you can just like share, and the more people who have access to them actually the more valuable the thing is. Like that's sort of things that are traditionally very hard to fund, but we potentially can find ways with this technology. So that's very interesting. I mean, in terms of like traditional businesses, it's interesting because like a lot of traditional businesses have this sort of command and control structure, right? That it's like go about solving a problem in a very specific way, and it works really well for certain things. For certain things, it doesn't work at all. And I think for established businesses, finding the sort of like where can't we are with our structure like solve the problems that we have, and then look into like, okay, can a more distributed sort of like approach where you sort of leverage the wisdom of the crowd in some way work better? And that's where I think like if you can find that thing that works, takes your business into that modality, that could be really interesting for businesses. But saying that is like much easier than actually doing it.
That execution, absolutely, and especially public goods is a very complex topic. And there, I know, Elizabeth, that of course you've been working with governments, UK governments specifically. And I wanted to ask you, so one of the main characteristics, as we just discussed, is of course this transparency, verifiability, at least to some extent. So public blockchains like Ethereum, Celo, Polygon, they all offer you a way to see all of the transactions. So do you have some thoughts about the advantages and disadvantages of this feature?
Well, I think Joel and Kathy both kind of touched on this in the introductory remarks about the nature of Web3, and one of the things that people talk about a lot is the potential of Web3 to give people more power or more autonomy over their own personal data. And I think when we contrast that with the kind of Web 2 evolution and the kind of the use of personal data collection, widespread collection, and economy built around that, Web 3 offers quite an interesting alternative. In theory, it's an idealistic idea and complicated in practice, but yes, I guess that would be a potential advantage. Kathy also touched on the idea of integrity of data. So obviously in cybersecurity, we talk sometimes about CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability of data as the kind of 3 pillars that you want to be sure of what you've got where it is, and have trust in that. So again, it's underpinning that integrity of data.
Do we actually know of any governments that have progressed in their experiments with utilizing blockchains for even public goods funding or other types of governance? I know that UK issued several papers on experimenting within different areas, but Kathy, I wondered if you would be able to tell us more. Looks like you're nodding.
I was going to say, you know, apart from El Salvador's experiment with Bitcoin, maybe has anyone followed up on that in the when the prices dropped? I think someone should probably do that. I mean, the obvious examples are, you know, countries like Estonia, which don't necessarily have blockchain per se, but they do have. Well, it's close enough to blockchain to call it blockchain, and there are some interesting experiments actually. Not necessarily done by the government themselves, but there's some interesting experiments being done by BIS, so the Bank of International Settlements, and then there's some really interesting work that I think was started in Singapore as well, where they've been looking at it for different aspects. And then the Australian government has been really quite forward-looking, you know, in terms of application of these technologies. So there is a little bit out there. But again, you know, like all new technologies, I think it is worthwhile to be sort of a little bit more circumspect. I guess Elizabeth, maybe you with your previous role in UK government might know a little bit more about where they actually are.
Yeah, I can't comment on the UK government at the moment. That was some time ago.
That's absolutely fair. I know several governments are looking into it, but of course everything is moving slowly, also due to the risks that every new technology poses. So the question here is also that I know several businesses, established businesses, will be asking themselves is, but what about the existing privacy laws? What about GDPR? What about other privacy laws? Do they apply? And how do we actually ensure that we comply with those? So Jocelyn, Elizabeth, questions for you. Privacy-related regulations, do these apply? And what are the main risks for businesses that want to enter Web3 and at least experiment with some applications? What should they consider?
So they absolutely do apply. There's no reason they don't. There's certainly no exemption for blockchain, Web3, decentralized technologies. There's obviously some challenges. One being whose privacy laws apply. If you have a decentralized system with operators in lots of jurisdictions, then who is what we would call the controller, the person who's legally responsible for compliance? And you work that out either because it's a business that's registered in a jurisdiction, or the UK EU laws have what we call extraterritorial effect. So they capture people outside of those jurisdictions, but who are trying to monitor or provide services to people within those jurisdictions. And other countries around the world, Chinese personal information, Data Protection Act, for example, they are replicating those kind of extraterritorial reaches. So it starts to create a very complicated landscape. So whose laws apply to me is sort of question one, and how does that work in a decentralized setup as well, which is where I need support from like Kathy and Joel to help actually work that out. But it would apply to someone who is creating the service and is the touch point with people who then want to use a blockchain service. And so all the principles would apply in terms of ensuring you have a lawful ground for processing, you have a privacy notice that tells people, here's what I'm going to do with your data, and here's why I'm doing it, and here's how long I'm keeping it, which is interesting in an immutable system where you can't change a record. And here are the rights you have over your data, like the right to erasure and be forgotten. And how does that reconcile with, again, an immutable record where that is arguably technically, you'll tell me, possible or not. And so, as you say, a lot, we were talking about this before, Nadia, a lot of that has really flown under the radar. And I remember getting questions about this when sort of blockchain first became a recognized technology, maybe in legal circles sort of 6-7 years ago. And then the questions have all gone much, much quieter as people have got on quietly developing it and using it and not worrying maybe so much about privacy compliance. But as you say, as it becomes a more sophisticated, mature industry, these kinds of questions get asked because So outside of this industry, across privacy more broadly, since 2018, privacy compliance has gone up. All kind of risk registers, investors ask questions, startups don't get funded unless they can show there is some level of diligence around privacy. So as the industry progresses, absolutely, it's an issue that will surface.
Thank you so much. And of course, we've also seen a similar level of maturity and focus on privacy hitting other sectors. So the idea here that the Web3 ecosystem will mature to that level where privacy laws and regulation will become more important. Whereas right now, and I know that Joel and Kathy will agree, the focus has been on financial regulation and how to comply with that. And is it really a thing? Another issue here becomes, and of course, Joel will know that very well, is that a lot of these groups and teams that are building are distributed and organized into something that is a DAO. Who is the legal entity? Who bears the responsibility? And the Tornado Cash case that fairly recently been issued. I know, Joel, that you're familiar with that. Do you maybe have some thoughts that you want to add on regulatory complications and enforcement?
Well, I'm not an expert at all here. I mean, I think there's a case right now in the US about like DAOs and responsibility of like people who are participants in the DAO. If they're like, if you're not voting, you're responsible for every action that the DAO takes. There's some like differing opinions there, but there are like those sort of discussions ongoing. In the case of Tornado Cash, it's pretty sad that like the effort to like actually build privacy preserving technology that make this more usable for like actually real world use cases actually got sanctioned by the US for various reasons, which we can go into if we want, but I'm not going to dive into it right now.
No, it is a very sad case where one of the main developers have actually been jailed by the Dutch regulator for sanctions violated in the US. So there's a lot happening on the front, and we will see more. But on that topic, so I know that privacy-related applications are being built in Web3, and maybe Kathy, you would want to tell us a little bit about what is exactly, how is the ecosystem viewing privacy, how do they want to preserve it, and what change is happening there? I think you're on mute.
Apologies. So I think, you know, one of the things about at least the cryptocurrency space is that it has always been founded with this idea of almost, you know, for want of a better word, psychotic levels of privacy. So everyone wants to be anonymous, right? So the whole idea behind Bitcoin was that it was peer-to-peer, and that you would not be, nobody would know what the transaction was. So it would be like a cash transaction. The reality of that, of course, is that if you wanted to actually function in the real world and in the financial system, there's these things called, you know, anti-money laundering and KYC that people have to comply with. So there are some really interesting challenges there. But I think what we're coming to as an ecosystem is this kind of finding a middle ground. So you won't find many you know, for example, platforms that don't perform KYC and AML. If they aren't doing that, then they're probably not particularly legal. But in terms of the broader ecosystem, one of the things that people are trying to do is use these technologies to ensure privacy. And one of the things I always try to exhort is that you don't necessarily get better privacy because you're using these types of technologies. And in particular, you know, it is possible to work out who you are, but there's a lot of work going on in the space, and I you know, the technology will improve over time, but at the moment it's not really necessarily, I would say, privacy. It's privacy preserving to a certain extent. Put it that way. There's some level of anonymity, but we can always work out who you are and what you're doing.
I would add a nuance to that, that the sort of requirement of like KYC and AML is generally in the centralized platforms that allows you to exchange between like a fiat currency and a cryptocurrency. So within the crypto ecosystem, we don't really have that in sort of the largest like decentralized exchanges. And if you have, if the crypto ecosystem manages to grow to the extent where you actually have a closed loop where people actually get paid and can use the crypto internally, we wouldn't necessarily have those sort of need for that on and off ramp.
We shall see what the future holds for that and how that will be implemented, because as Jocelyn said, privacy laws apply. So there's no reason why they shouldn't apply. Then my question again to Jocelyn, what about the laws about intellectual property rights, financial markets, consumer protection? Do they apply when we engage and build in Web3?
Again, there's no reason why they shouldn't, provided that everyone understands whose regime is applying, again, depending on whereabouts this system is based, because these are all very jurisdictional based laws, particularly about consumer protection, varies to some degree across Europe, very different in the US, very different in other cultures and economies. IP, the extent to which you can apply for patents for software is very different in the US to in the EU. So again, it's something developers are familiar with and would apply in the same way in a Web3 scenario. I think the challenge always with new technologies, I mean, we surfaced the question at the beginning that it's a technology, but what do you do with it? It's not a mean to an end. It's just a thing to help you get a result that you want. It's particularly with consumers trying to explain to a consumer in a way that's would satisfy a regulator, that it's sufficiently clear, simple language to explain what they are engaging with, the risks of what they're engaging with. We've been looking at this in an NFT space a little bit. You know, even decoding NFT to non-fungible token doesn't really get anyone any further forward in understanding what the thing is that they're trying to buy or exchange. So I think it's really challenging. I mean, Kathy talked about a sort of a decentralized, centralized system, which blew my mind, and I understand vaguely what's happening. So I think that is a real challenge with consumer law compliance, to be able to cross that boundary to facilitate their understanding and therefore actually achieve compliance with certainly laws in the UK and the EU.
Anyone has anything else to add to this? Because in my opinion, there's still a long way to go to full compliance with the existing laws and regulation. And the question is, what will move first? Well, will our regulators change the laws to facilitate for these main features of the new technology, or will they apply the law as it is today?
Well, I would, going back to the privacy related regulation, I can't speak about financial regulation specifically, but I think the laws are there already, and increasingly so. Data is covered under, Justin's mentioned the GDPR, but there's a whole raft of new European and draft European regulation, which does things like give people more power over their data and tell platforms that they need to be transparent about how they're using data and provide it to people when they ask for it. And actually, that's a lot like the vision for Web3. That's what people want. So in theory, that sounds good. Again, in practice, it's the technology does the development happen in a way that is conducive to that? Technically, can the platforms do what they need to do? Are the users also empowered to exercise the rights that they have?
Thank you very much. Yeah, Joel?
I was just, yeah, there's spiritual alignment between like parts of the crypto space and some of these privacy regulations. One last thing that I add is also that there are sort of like crypto native courts that are being developed to sort of create legal systems that are not tied to any particular boundary. So you can like tie your agreements to like this blockchain court rather than to like an off-chain. There's obviously like very early in development, but that's something that is happening that's worth having a look at.
Private arbitration in blockchain.
That's fascinating, man. Sorry, I've not heard of that. That is mind-blowing. So seriously, they're actually saying that they're going to, basically they're creating a new government and a new regulatory regime. Is that correct?
For me, what I looked into it's more like alternative dispute resolution.
Oh, right, okay. Oh,
very interesting.
The smart contract decides. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, alternative world of Web3. With that in mind, my next question to the panel would be, say, when you look at the regulatory landscape, when you look at the policymakers, in light of all of the scandals, in light of the speed of the developments, say, what are the main trends and concerns influencing the policymakers and regulators on the topic of Web3 today? Elizabeth, maybe you want to start. I know you have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, a couple of things. I would talk about compliance. We've mentioned that already, but privacy-related regulation-related compliance. Obviously, there's huge fines, or well, large fines associated with non-compliance. In addition to that, there's the risk of loss. So financial loss, we've seen big crypto hacks, 500, 600 million dollars being stolen. So there's real risks associated with kind of Web3 and some of the associated technologies. Other things I think I would touch on, particularly relevant in the UK, is the idea of harmful content online. So there's the draft online safety bill, which seeks to regulate harmful content online in response to some of the bad things that we've seen, harmful content around on social media, all sorts of topics, but could mention things like child abuse online, extremist content, that kind of thing. And that's very much a concern to regulators and policymakers, how to get the balance right between encouraging innovation and technical development, and then also the kind of free speech, freedom of expression debates around what should and shouldn't take place online.
Thank you very much. Jocelyn, do you want to add to this? It's your area of expertise as well.
For me, I think the regulators tend to focus where they fear there is the potential for greatest harm and where they can have the greatest impact. So they've clearly focused on the KYC, AML aspects to be clear about the checks and sort of compliance that Elizabeth was talking about is taking place to protect people from just handing over money to unwittingly sanction terrorism or nefarious groups, or protect them from just their money going into an ether and not being able to recover it in any way. So I feel until there is a core group of users or a core use for the technology where the regulators perceive there to be a risk to the public, consumers, society, they will sort of wait for that moment and then address it at that point in time. Regulators do tend to come following the technology rather than getting ahead of it. Obviously, they try and implement policies and use language that is technology neutral, so it can flex and change over time. So GDPR, we always talk about applying the principles around whatever the specifics of the context is. I imagine regulation and policy in this area would have to be the same. But I think it will be around protecting individuals and protecting where they feel the greatest harm may be caused.
Thank you so much. And of course, on that note, there's a lot of change that are on the way and a lot of new regulations that will be coming out. So what are the biggest regulatory changes that builders and operators in Web3 should keep an eye on? And I know, Kathy, that you also look at that are What would you say are the main headlines now? Are you still on mute?
The things for regulators to keep an eye on.
No, for builders and operators in Web3 to keep an eye on.
Yeah, so there's one thing that I think is something that everyone should actually keep an eye on with regards to this. And the fact is that, what do we mean when we talk about decentralization? I think, if you look and if you actually run there was a fantastic analysis done by ETH in one of the universities, where they illustrated that 90% of Bitcoin transactions and 85% of Ethereum transactions actually traverse one of 10 networks in the world. That is not decentralized. That means with approximately 1/3 of the transactions, so if you can capture 1/3 of those transactions, you can automatically work out who those people are, so that decentralization just sort of gets kicked over. But more importantly, that is actually a way that you could do some relatively interesting fraud. I'm not saying I'm working on that. I'm just saying that it is possible, because it actually helps. It can actually break down this concept of decentralization itself. You know, so the thing that I think we should all be cognizant of and thinking about and working towards is, what are the key benefits of decentralization? What are we actually trying to achieve with these technologies, and where do we actually need to execute those interventions? So I truly believe that some aspects of decentralization are fantastic and should be done, but you know, we need to be very careful about what we're promising end users, but also about what we're genuinely actually building. We're building decentralization on the application layer of the internet. That's what we're doing. That's one thing that I'm very keen on. And the other thing is, how can we use this to do some genuine good in the world, not just more DeFi? Because, you know, what's the point of that? Sorry.
Yeah, solving real life problems today. And of course, I also know that a lot of teams that have been building, they've been innovating without a solution looking for a problem and not the other way around. So that's you advocating to focusing on problems and solving those. So thank you very much. And of course, I also know that there's, as Elizabeth mentioned, there's been a lot of bad cases with bad publicity, a lot of money being stolen. And this is where I want to touch on the aspect of the third pillar of our conversation, and that is security. So security, and how is security in Web3 different to security in Web2? So let me ask you this question. We hear on regular basis funds are being stolen, protocols are being abused by fraudsters, and more. So I want to understand the main characteristics of the technology stack of Web3 in relation to securities, and what is the normal pattern of protocols and applications, dApps being abused. And Joel, I want to ask you, can you very basic terms explain why these big frauds are so prevalent and common?
Yeah. Well, why they're so common, I think we as an ecosystem have done a shit job of like actually creating tools and systems to just like help people that are new into the ecosystem understand what they're doing and understand where the risk lie. So like as a community, we need to do a way better job at that. I would say that there's like, so the base layer of like the blockchain, the sort of like the core infrastructure, that's pretty secure. Like that's working well. And if hacks were happening on that layer, like either this blockchain that's being used would be like, no one would care about it. It's not secure. So like if you have like Bitcoin or Ethereum, like these sort of base layers, they're pretty secure. You have like, you know, if someone hacks it, they can have all the money on the system. So it's definitely worthwhile to try to do it. Then you have like two main things that are getting hacked. One is these big centralized exchanges. FTX is sort of an example of that. It was mismanaged as well. If that had been completely on the blockchain and working well, they couldn't really have done sort of like the same sort of fraud that they did. Then you have like these bridges. So bridges between blockchains, where it's like two base layers might be super secure, but actually sending coins between these two blockchains is really difficult to do securely. And there's been a lot of projects just like building up a bridge pretty quickly, and then it's been hacked and sort of without proper audits on the code base and things like that. So that's sort of like where some of the big hacks have come from.
So several pillars, several subtopics, and of course, blockchains are not equal. There's a difference, as Joel points out. Some of them, public blockchains, are failing once a week. Others have never been hacked, such as Bitcoin. Kathy, do you want to add to this question? So elaborate on the main characteristics of the technology stack and in relation to security, and why do we see so many hacks?
Yeah, I mean, I can. I'll take a bit more of maybe a professor's approach, in the sense that I think one of the issues that we have more broadly in society, and this is not just a problem with Bitcoin or cryptocurrency or any of these things, is actually the way that we teach computer science. What we tend to have is two things, right? We teach them a lot of math, we teach them a lot of algorithms, and then they get a bit of cybersecurity quite often tacked on at the end of their degrees. And as they leave, we sort of wave and say, don't forget to be ethical, right? And I think that is almost the way we're using technology, the way we're using computer code these days is so deeply embedded into society, and it's now having such a broad impact on the world that I think almost we need to rethink the way that we structure education for engineers, and basically say ethics and cybersecurity should almost come up front, and then we'll teach the algorithms. And I get very little support for this when I when I try to bring it up in a university, though. So the other thing is that the other basic driver here is greed. You know, if people can see that they can, you know, not everybody will do it, but if people can see that they can manipulate code to get themselves a lot of money. So, for example, in the very first DAO that got hacked with 150 million US dollars, it was very simple. It was 2 lines of code. If they had been switched around, they wouldn't have been able to do that. So there's two things. One, if people can find a way to steal your money, someone is probably going to do it. So greed. But the other thing is that the basics of cybersecurity and the basics of correctly delivered and built code is a very important aspect that I think many people are underestimating. You know, I quite often see people saying that we can audit the code of Satoshi Nakamoto. Well, can you? How many people on this call could actually go and audit the code of Satoshi Nakamoto? Yeah, there's probably Joel. If you know what I mean. There's myself. So I think it's another thing for us to be quite cognizant of. But I also think that's a very broad problem across all of society. You will see that, you know, you can hack Bluetooth. You can hack. There was a great thing about hacking a Tesla via its Bluetooth port, right? So
it's actually a very good point, but I think our media has been so focused on the crypto and Web3 ecosystem and highlighting all of the fraud, the mistakes that have been happening there. And of course, I wondered whether open source, in your opinion, makes it easier for the hackers to attack because it's out there in the open?
Yeah, so, you know, there's two thought processes around that, right? One is that more eyes mean less bugs. So the more people you have looking at the code, the better the code becomes, the more improved it becomes. But at the same time, you are effectively handing over the entirety of the code to people who are both good and bad actors. So, you know, the open source aspect could be problematic, but at the same time, if you look at many of the code bases that are out there in the world, they're probably suffering from some level of insecurity as well, and they're private code bases. I don't think if there is a security hole, people will find it, and the only thing that we have against that is constant, you know, vigilance, basically. And Joel might have something to say.
Yeah, I guess just one thing to add to that is, if there's a DeFi protocol or some like Web3 protocol that is not open source, how can I trust that not to steal my money? Because, you know, it might do whatever.
Sure, but of course you're in the lucky position that you can actually read the code. A lot of users who interact with Web3 don't have that.
I think this is an important aspect, right? Like, just because you can't read it doesn't mean that you don't know someone or you trust the community that has read that code. So it's sort of like that trust through like your sort of web of trust, if you may.
The core nature of the community, of the Web3 community, is built on trust and ethics. And Joel,
but I would, sorry.
Elizabeth, please.
Well, I would also add that exploiting that trust is what enables hacks and attacks a lot of the time. So we will everyone on this call will have received a phishing email or text, you know, asking to click on a link. Often these can be very highly targeted and take advantage of our you know, our need or our want to access some information. So trust is can be a dangerous thing as well.
that is definitely prevalent in Web3, where we all have receipts, all sorts to our wallets to interact with, and one has to be extra vigilant. Joel, a question to you then. So what are the common practices now, and how does a Web3 protocol application ensures that it's safe and secure for its users? So what is the process there? Because we know the process is for Web2, what needs to happen, what is standard, but what about Web3?
Yeah, I mean, it depends a little bit about what you're building. Starting from like smart contract only type applications, the general best practice there is to have a formal verification of your code base, meaning that you have like a mathematical model that describes your contract, and then run like some computer program that verifies like, hey, this contract actually does exactly what it says. So you can have more guarantees about the program. And then of course, like audits by multiple firms if possible. Those are expensive, but they're definitely worth it. So like, I think those sort of practices are sort of the base layer. Then of course, like if you're building on top, like not necessarily in the smart contract layer, but building sort of using some decentralized database or something else, it might be more straightforward to use it, and then the underlying technology is secure, so you can sort of like trust it. But you should still sort of like stay sort of vigilant there and try to understand what's best for the sort of application that you're building.
Kathy, do you want to add to this? How does good look like?
Well, I think Joel's covered the main points actually, but you know, what does good look like is, I think when the only thing to add would be when we have ensured that we've had a conversation across society. I think one of the dangers that we're all of us geeks, shall we say, are a little bit too fond of is to think we're solving the world's problems with technology, but not actually engaging directly with the end user communities and more broadly across society to actually understand, you know, are we really solving the problem, or are we creating more? That would be the only thing I'd add to what Joel said.
Phenomenal. Guys, on this note, I know we have 5 minutes left, and I want to open to the audience for questions in the final minutes. A lot of nuggets of gold came out of this, and I know that people have been writing it down, so we will submit the responses gotten from you. So there's one question in the audience so far as I know. Let me just check it. So the question goes, do we know how insurance regulators or insurance firms are responding to companies using blockchain technology? And I think I'll focus on Elizabeth and Jocelyn. Is it something that you came across?
Not directly so far. Elizabeth might have a broader view. My only comment would be to say that I know that cyber insurance, as a name on a policy, is a very diverse thing. It means different things to different people. There are lots of specific activities it covers and doesn't cover. So I think clients that I work with find it quite hard to truly understand what they're buying or to know what they need, because it is not one thing to all people. How insurance companies view the risks around blockchain, or whether they are insuring the providers of wallet services or exchanges or users, I don't have any direct experience of that.
Joel, Kathy, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I can't add to that, I'm afraid.
I mean, there was some work done. I did some work with Australian insurers that was really quite interesting, and that ended up being a regulatory quagmire that we solved. Basically, it was, you know, it was, well, okay. So in Australia, there's a lot of car theft where they take them out into the outback, they saw them in half, and then they weld them together. So the two halves. So quite often you'll have the front welded to a different end of the other car. And they wanted to understand how to overcome that fraud and also make safer cars. And so what they did was they created a consortium between all of the insurers in Australia. And the very first thing that happened was the regulator knocked on the door and said, well, we want full access to all of this to make sure there's no, you know, threat to the consumer here, because they wanted to ensure there's no consumer protection, basically. So they're interested, but I think it's a very complex regulatory environment.
So yet to be seen. Insurance companies sometimes tend to be at the forefront of the developments, as with climate risk, and other times they're lagging behind, as with utilizing tech in construction. I have one more question from the audience, and I'm mindful of time. We have a few minutes left. We might go around just by a few minutes, but the next question is nice and short and sweet. What do you think of the future of cybersecurity in cryptocurrency? Are they going to be more secure in the future? So I will take a round. Elizabeth, do you think it'll be more secure in the future?
Well, based on the fact that I see people as a vulnerability and people don't change, I'd say no. Potentially attackers will have to up their game and think of more creative ways to get inside people's networks and assets. But fundamentally, I don't think too much will change.
Joel, what about you? Will it be more secure in the future?
So I think Elizabeth touched on the right point. Like, if we can build tools that enable people to actually secure their own keys, then we have the potential to make systems much more secure, because now our data and our financial assets and stuff are not locked in a centralized database that one or a few companies control, but they're actually locked with each individual user. So we can figure out how to help people hold their keys secure, then yes.
Thank you. Kathy, will it be more secure in the future?
Every time you create a security improvement, hackers create a hacking improvement. So it's a constant game. I think also the other issue is, of course, that more broadly in society, we need to think about cybersecurity. We can see quantum computing, you can already see that people are making huge efforts on that. But it's a constant game of cat and mouse, right? You've got to keep ahead of the game.
Thank you very much. Jocelyn, what are your thoughts?
I am definitely the least qualified person here to talk about the cybersecurity aspects, but I think it's definitely an area where there will be further laws around actual security requirements. There are not many laws at the moment in this country anyway that say if you are this sort of provider, you have to adhere to this standard of security or this level. I think we will see more around that, not prescribing particular security techniques for the very reasons Kathy has just given, but sort of requirements around adequacy of protection, frequency of review, reporting, mandate, those kinds of governance regimes.
So much more to come for the builders and businesses curious or currently building in Web3. We will expect greater scrutiny, more regulation, and more eyeballs on the space, I guess. I'm receiving a lot of thank yous and for the wonderful sessions to all the speakers. And from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for joining me and the rest of 50-something people. You've been listening. Listening to you on this evening, and I'll pass to Sophie very briefly if she has something to ask.
Yeah, thank you so much to all the speakers and to Nadja. What a fantastic session. I completely agree with the comments in the chat that this was very, very informative. This is just a thank yous for everybody who have helped us create this. Of course, Nadja, the speakers, Benjamin, as well as Deanne and the marketing team in the background, and of course also Gunnar, who's the managing director. I myself am Sophie. I head up the Young Professionals, and we've got lots of events coming up. Please take a notice that this is being recorded, so if you would like to get the recording, please reach out to Gunnar, Deanne, or myself.